Hey, everybody out there. We have again with us Mark Collinsworth, a financial expert and also an observer of all things globally, internationally, and right now, what's going on with Ukraine. Now, today, our president said that he is convinced that Ukraine will be invaded by Russia in days or weeks. Now, we've heard this before, and Mark and I have been trying for some time now to figure out what is the real story behind all the huffing and puffing and the posturing. Mark, what is going on?
I think a lot of this is just, playing politics. The Biden administration really hasn't had a lot of positive things to brag about. So I think this is kind of the tail wags the dog. And a lot of my reason behind this also is, Biden keeps saying, oh, Putin's going to invade any day now. Well, let's just look at the facts from a tactical standpoint. Right now, it's been raining in the Ukraine. That's going to create mud. The ground is starting to thaw out. Mud and tanks don't go well together. Not to mention, this week is a full moon. So right now, there's about a 96% illumination in the Ukraine. You really don't want to run an attack with 96% illumination because you can see the airplanes flying at night and you can shoot at them. Ideally, you want to shoot at an airplane. You want to fly your airplanes in to run bombing missions. You want 0% illumination, which we won't go to a new moon until March 2nd. So it's just really weird them saying this when,
Yeah, they keep pumping this up, keeping everybody alarmed. We're on the brink of war and this and that. Is this at least in part a ploy to make our commander in chief look like he's really in charge, he's really steadfast, to erase the withdrawal from Afghanistan and all the baggage that goes with that attached to Biden? So is that part of it?
I think that's a big part of it because, like I said, Joe Biden, who's always run on the platform that he knows a lot about, foreign policy and international relations, Afghanistan has showed that he really does not.
Well, another thing that doesn't make sense is when they interview people in Kiev, nobody seems alarmed. Everybody's they're going to cafes, they're doing shopping. Nobody's packing up, nobody's fleeing, nobody's building bunkers or anything like that.
Well,
and the president now, Zelensky, is out of the country meeting with our Vice President Kamala Harris in Munich to discuss the whole situation. So, it doesn't gel.
Well, yeah, and that's just like what 2 weeks ago, Biden was talking about, hey, they're going to invade any day now, and they didn't invade. And the president of the Ukraine saying, hey, dude, you got to cool it. You've got to cool it. That what you're saying is not what's happening. Yeah. I mean, that's just, it goes back to it. Biden probably knows there's not going to be an invasion, but if he sits back and says, hey, I'm working hard to stop the invasion, he gets credit for it if it turns out to be military exercises like Putin says.
See, I'm wondering if the deal hasn't already been made behind the scenes between Putin and Biden that, okay, we're going to hype this up, but we'll give you the concessions about not having Ukraine join NATO, about removing some missiles from Poland and other places. So we'll back off. But, in the meantime, we want to hype it up so that when you withdraw after we've given you these concessions, I could look good. Could that be what's going on?
It could be that too. Let's not forget that time that Obama got caught on the hot mic talking to one of the Russian representatives and said, right, hey, we got an election going on. I really can't support you right now, but after the elections, I'll have a whole lot more power to help you out. I mean, same thing. It's you scratch my back, I scratch your back.
Yeah, so I mean, this is like all smoke and mirrors. But what I find also disturbing and also comical is how the reporters are just lapping up what's being fed to them by the Pentagon and their exclusive inside sources from the military. Like they're not even questioning, they're not at all skeptical, they're not even qualifying the statements that according to the Pentagon, this is what's going on. They just put it out as fact. There's no kind of examination of what they're being fed by the Biden administration and by the Pentagon.
Well, unfortunately, this is one of the things that reporters pretty much have to rely just on the White House because Fox News and all those people, they don't have access to Pentagon satellite images. They don't have access to intelligence resources on the ground. So everything they're being fed to them by the U.S. government. And of course, when it comes to intelligence, as I've always been told, what's another name for intelligence to the public? It's called lies.
As a matter of fact, none of these reporters are bringing up or even alluding to in any way that we've been through this with the intelligence community before, such as weapons of mass destruction,
Exactly. Yeah.
that Saddam Hussein had that turned out to be not so. And on and on over the years, they create whatever intelligence they want the public to swallow.
Oh, and I remember General Powell sitting there when he gave the speech to the UN. He's up there with that little bottle of nerve gas or whatever, shaking it. Like they had actually found that bottle of nerve gas there in Iraq. And then after everything was said and done, didn't find one iota.
Yeah. Well, let's assume that this may be one scenario that's playing out, that it's really just a bunch of hocus pocus to make Biden look good and to give Putin the concessions he wants without making that public. And don't forget, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, something similar happened where, we backed off Khrushchev. They withdrew their ships from Cuba, took the missiles out. But what wasn't really publicized very much is that we also removed missiles from Turkey in exchange down the line. So these other concessions may play out kind of secretly in the months following whatever happens here with the confrontation or the non-confrontation.
Oh, yeah, this kind of stuff happens all the time. I'm sure Biden and Putin have had a conversation. Biden's told Putin, hey, man, I'm in really bad shape for a re-election here. I'm for you guys all, go communism, help me get re-elected, and I'll do whatever you want, but scratch my back and I'll do something down the road. Like, I'll even I'll get the CIA to start a coup in the Ukraine, and we'll just have the Ukrainian vote you as president.
Another thing that I find at least a little bit suspicious is how the Pentagon and Biden keep pumping up this false flag attack by the Russians so that they could blame the Ukrainians. Well, maybe that'll be our false flag to blame the Russians when it wasn't the Russians that started it.
Well, speaking of false flag, the Gulf of Tonkin incident that got us involved in the Vietnam War, that was a false flag that the United States used to say, hey, we need to get more involved in Vietnam.
Yeah. Well, let's assume we're wrong, and this is for real. Now, what could go wrong, the worst case scenario, if Russia does invade and, we're giving support to Ukraine, not directly, but, can this get out of control, and can it blow up in something really serious involving the U.S. through either incompetence or through miscalculation?
I think this thing, if anything happens, I have a gut feeling a lot of it's already been negotiated out. You've already heard Biden talk about, hey, if you have a minor invasion of Ukraine, we're not going to consider that an invasion. You've already had Biden say, hey, we're not going to commit any troops to the Ukraine to defend it. I mean, you've already starting to see things that are appearing that have already opened the door. If Putin did want to invade, he has already got kind of a free ticket to do so, because I think a lot of this has already been negotiated.
And, perhaps it'll be just the minor incursion will involve the eastern half of Ukraine, which is highly Russian identified. And actually, the Russian population in eastern Ukraine wants to be part of Russia. So maybe it'll just go that far.
Exactly. And this also goes back to, technically, Russia's already invaded the Ukraine. Look at Crimea. They walked in there and took that when Obama and Biden were in the White House. And neither one of them did anything to even try to stop that. They just said, hey, Putin, you can't do that. Stop it.
Yeah, the Crimea. But again, people don't understand the history of this, where Ukraine had been part of Russia for centuries. And also Crimea, what's vital to Russia about that is that the naval base, where they could go into through the Mediterranean, it's their only outlet into the wider ocean. Otherwise, they're landlocked and they're consigned to cold water ports. So it's vital for them to have that. And again, it's a vital interest for Russia's defense, but we don't see it that way.
Yeah, same thing happened. Putin doesn't want missiles in the Ukraine because they can hit Moscow, just like the United States didn't want Russian missiles in Cuba in the 1960s.
Yeah, but those points are not at all being explained to the American public so that Putin could be built up as the bad guy, that it's unreasonable for him to expect any of these concessions. And they don't realize that he wants security for Russia with all this encroaching on his border. It's too much. And don't forget, there was like a gentleman's agreement between Gorbachev and
Yep.
Bush, the father, about NATO not expanding any further east and Russia not expanding any further west after the fall of the Soviet Union. But we've been encroaching despite that agreement that held it as a status quo for years.
Correct. Since Soviet Union officially collapsed, I think we've now brought 11, 12 countries that used to be the part of the old Iron Curtain of Russia
Right.
have now become part of NATO. And even Putin said, hey, at some point we've got to stand up. We can't retreat any further back. And if you allow the Ukraine, you've now taken the entire Iron Curtain and you basically have converted it into NATO.
Yeah. And we've discussed this before, that it really isn't in Putin's interest to try to take over the entire Ukraine or any of the other countries nearby, either near NATO countries or actual NATO countries. And, they talk about him wanting to rebuild the Soviet Union. That's his grand design. It would be impractical and it wouldn't benefit him to make a move like that, correct?
It would not, because the Soviet Union had basically gotten so big and was trying to support so many of these offshoot type countries like Georgia and such, that those kind of led into the Soviet Union collapsing upon itself. And just in this scenario, if Putin, Russia doesn't have a very strong economy. Really, oil is really their only cash flow they have, and it's very expensive to run a war. If Putin moves into the Ukraine, well, if the EU, the NATO, and the United States, we may not put troops in, but if we start supplying armaments, I mean, Javelin missiles. Javelin missiles really just wreak havoc on Russian tanks. I mean, Putin just doesn't have the cash flow for this thing to stretch this thing out for 3, 4, 5 months.
Yeah. But again, let's assume we're wrong and an invasion is going to take place. Worst case scenario, what happens in terms of our own interests and involvement?
Well, the worst case scenario is, you put U.S. troops in there and something goes wrong and you end up, going into a nuclear war. But the odds of that happening are far, far away. I think the most realistic worst scenario is they basically come into the Ukraine and the United States slaps huge amounts of sanctions onto Russia, and then Russia counters that by basically cutting the oil supply off to Europe.
And yeah, what happens to Europe then? How are they going to get the oil since we kind of shut down our production here?
Well, that's where you might start getting into a problem if it stretches out too long, especially if it stretches out into the next winter and you have people starting to freeze to death in Europe because they can't get the natural gas and oil from Russia. Does that become a tipping point where the NATO says, hey, we've got to now invade Russia? I mean, that could be a scenario, but that's a lot of ifs and a long ways off.
Well, short of that, though, if it's just a Russian invasion of Ukraine and it doesn't spread regionally, how would that, since you're the finance guy, you make your living with giving financial advice and investments, what will happen in terms of our economy? Will it take any kind of a significant hit over a Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Well, if it stays mild, no, there won't be any kind of hit. But the U.S. economy is already starting to show signs of a slowdown. So you're going to probably slow down even more. I mean, at this point, and this is looking at the yield curve between the 2-year Treasury bond and the 10-year Treasury bond. When there's only a 50 basis point difference or half a percentage point difference between the two. Historically, when you get that close, you have to put yourself on recession watch, because those two bond yields should not be getting that close in a strong economy.
Kind of shifting gears here a little bit in our closing remarks. Put aside any invasion of Ukraine, considering what's going on economically and other aspects, where are we headed over the next 6 months? Are we going into a recession?
Well, it depends. That really depends on how much the Fed raises interest rates. I think they can raise 25, maybe 50. But once you start getting beyond 50, based on the economic data I'm seeing, we could be faced with a recession, which also brings it back, the LEI, which is called the leading economic indicators, which is basically an economic index that forecasts the future of the economy over the next 3 to 5 months. Those numbers came out today, and I didn't really see anything on the news about it because the Ukraine news took so much of the time up with Biden talking. Do they see the economy slowing, and they're trying to, again, divert people's attention away from some really bad economic data that's come out here in the last 2 or 3 weeks?
And against the Durham probe on Hillary.
That too, yep.
But, just for the layman who may not know what a basis point is, 50 basis points would be half a percentage point raise in interest rates, correct?
Correct. So when you say 100 basis points, that's actually 1%. When you say, 10 basis points, that is 10% of 1%. So it takes 100 basis points to make a full percentage point.
Now, it seems small, a half percentage point, but even a half percentage point does have some effect, does it not?
It does, because what happens is when they raise that 25 basis points, your banks and everyone starts to forecast what's the next move. So even if they raise 25 basis points, your banks, your credit cards, they'll start to raise rates knowing that there's future rates coming. Not to mention, the mortgage rates are tied to the 10-year Treasury bond yield. Well, when everything started falling apart here with COVID, your 10-year Treasury bond yield fell through the floor, and it drove, mortgage rates down to 3%. But mortgage rates kind of stopped at 3%, but the 10-year Treasury bond yield kept falling. Now the 10-year Treasury bond's gone up, and the mortgage rates have gone up from that 3%. So mortgage rates right now are running about 4%. So it wouldn't surprise me that come, March or April, when we hit peak home building season, that you see a very dramatic slowdown in the home building market.
Now, the Fed has kind of telegraphed already that there'll be a series of rises in interest rates. So cumulatively, it could be how much over the next year?
Oh, usually the Fed raises interest rates to the point to where they cause a problem. I think in this current scenario, 75 to 100 is about the most they can probably do without causing a problem with where the economy is currently at.
That would be total over the series, like 4, 5, or 6 different rate hikes. It'd be a total of 1%.
Correct. But this is my main thing. Going back over history, you've never seen the Federal Reserve start raising interest rates and not cause a problem. So that's why I'm building up cash, because that's one thing the Fed is consistent at. They create problems.
Yeah, so it would be, again, in order to slow down inflation, they've got to raise interest rates, but that in turn will slow down the economy even more, which could lead to a recession.
Correct. And they're kind of running into a problem. They're trying to raise interest rates to the inflation's actually coming from 2 places: supply chain and oil prices. And the Fed's raising interest rates to try to slow something that really they don't have that much control over. So, and the reason why that's kind of concerning is, one, gas prices always rise going into the summer because that's when we hit peak travel season for vacation stuff. Once you get past the summer, oil prices fall off, and you see that the pressure that oil's put on inflation, that kind of pulls back in the second half of the year. Also, another thing is, if you look at the supply chain problems, you are actually starting to see a little bit of the supply chain problem is actually starting to alleviate itself. And I have a feeling the Fed's going to raise interest rates to slow the economy, and these problems are going to start fixing themselves from supply chains and oil in the second half of the year. And in the second half of the year, you could see inflation take a pretty good drop to the downside.
So they might pull it out then.
Oh no, they'll keep on raising rates because, and this is the main reason, is because the Federal Reserve knows there's going to be a recession somewhere down the road. They have to reload the guns for that next recession. Because if they keep rates here, give you an example, historically, whenever the Feds had to cut rates to ward off a recession, they usually have to cut 200 basis points. Well, if them sitting at 0.25 right now, if they don't raise interest rates up, the next recession they'll have to cut 200 basis points from where they're currently at, which means interest rates will be negative. So they have to reload the gun to prevent the negative interest rates in the future, if that all made sense.
Yeah. All right. Well, Mark Collinsworth of Vere Global Wealth Management, thanks once again for being with us, for your insights in the economy and also geopolitical politics, how it's all shaping up in Ukraine and what the blowback will be here in the United States. Mark, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Loved it.